Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whispering Trees. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. Just 4 friends escaping the chaos of city life. The forest, they had heard, was serene and untouched by the bustling world they knew. Maya, the ever-curious one, had found a place online. It was a remote camping ground called Blackwood Forest, nestled far away from civilization. She convinced the group that it was a place of unparalleled beauty, with towering pines, crystal clear streams, and a view of the night sky unlike any other. People exaggerate online, Maya said, brushing off the warnings she had come across. The tales of disappearances, whispered curses, and eerie phenomena were just folklore. She reasoned, stories meant to scare off thrill seekers. Her friends, Derek, Sarah, and Liam, weren't as convinced. Derek had rolled his eyes when Maya dismissed the warnings, muttering, legends come from somewhere. But Sarah, always eager for adventure, sided with Maya. Liam, quiet and brooding as ever, simply shrugged, unwilling to be left out of the group. By the time they arrived at Blackwood Forest, the sun was already dipping low, painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson. The drive had been long and uneventful, save for the occasional pothole. They parked their car near the trailhead and hiked 2 miles to a secluded clearing surrounded by a thick wall of trees. It was perfect, too perfect. The group quickly set up camp, erecting 2 tents and building a modest fire. The scent of pine mixed with the smoky aroma of burning wood as they laughed, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under the deepening sky. When the stars emerged, it felt like they were the only souls in the world. But that sense of peace shattered when Liam suddenly stiffened. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others fell silent, straining their ears. At first, all they could hear was the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. But then they heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. "It's just the breeze," Maya said, though her voice faltered. Derek frowned. "That doesn't sound like the wind. It sounds like voices." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Sarah broke the tension with a forced laugh. "Come on, guys. It's probably just the trees creaking or animals moving around. Let's not freak ourselves out." Reluctantly, they agreed and returned to their conversation, though the mood was dampened. The whispers didn't return, and soon, the group decided to call it a night. The first night, Maya and Sarah shared 1 tent, while Derek and Liam took the other. As the campfire died down and the forest grew darker, the quiet became oppressive. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you hear things that aren't there. In the middle of the night, Maya awoke to a sound, faint, like someone softly calling her name. "Maya." She sat up, her heart pounding. "Sarah," she whispered, nudging her friend. But Sarah was sound asleep, her soft snores a contrast to the eerie stillness outside. Maya, the voice was clearer now, coming from outside the tent. It was low and almost melodic, carrying a strange familiarity. Against her better judgment, she unzipped the tent and peeked out. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the moonlight. Maya, the voice came again, and this time it was unmistakable. It sounded like Derek, but strained, like he was in pain. Maya's breath quickened. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, her bare feet sinking into the cool earth. "Derek?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The whisper stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from deeper in the forest, she saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. "Maya, come here," the voice said. It wasn't Derek. The tone was wrong, too distorted to be human. Fear rooted her to the spot as she realized the shadow was coming closer. A hand grabbed her shoulder, and she screamed, "Maya, it's me." Sarah's voice pulled her back. She turned to see Sarah standing at the tent entrance, her face pale. "What are you doing?" I heard Derek calling me," Maya stammered. "He's in the tent with Liam," Sarah said. Her tone carried an edge of disbelief, but also concern. "Come back inside." Reluctantly, Maya let Sarah lead her back to the tent. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The second day. The next morning, Maya recounted what had happened. Derek and Liam, groggy but alert, listened carefully. "We need to leave," Liam said, his tone flat. "It was probably just a dream," Sarah said, though her confidence wavered. "No," Maya insisted. "It wasn't a dream. Something's out there." But Maya's protests were overruled. They had come too far to leave after one night, and Derek assured them that they were safe. "If it happens again," he said, "we'll go. But let's not jump to conclusions." That day, they explored the forest, marveling at its beauty. But there was an unease in the air, a heaviness they couldn't shake. The trees seemed taller than they had the day before, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. And the whispers, they were back, faint and teasing, always just beyond their reach. The second night, that night, it was Derek who woke up first. He heard his name, "Derek." He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The voice was soft but insistent, and it came from just outside the tent. "Who's there?" He called, but there was no response. He shook Liam awake. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Liam asked groggily. But before Derek could explain, the whisper came again, this time louder. "Derek." Liam's eyes widened. He heard it too. They stepped outside together, flashlights in hand. The forest was unnaturally still, the air cold enough to make their breath visible. The whispers surrounded them now, overlapping and growing louder. And then they saw it, a figure standing among the trees. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't walk, it glided. "What the hell is that?" Derek whispered. Before Liam could answer, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows. Without thinking, Derek ran after it, ignoring Liam's shouts to stop. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. By the time Liam caught up, Derek was gone. The vanishing. Panic set in. One by one, the group members began to disappear. First Derek, then Sarah. Each time, the whispers grew louder, the forest darker. Maya and Liam tried to leave, but no matter which direction they went, they always ended up back at the clearing. "It's the trees," Liam said finally. "They're trapping us." By the third night, only Maya remained. She sat by the dying campfire, tears streaming down her face as the whispers closed in. The aftermath. When rangers found the campsite a week later, all they discovered were the tents and the faint echo of whispers carried by the wind. No trace of the campers was ever found. The legend of Blackwood Forest lived on, but no one dared return. Story 2. The Phantom Hiker. Ethan hated cities. The noise, the crowds, the relentless pace. It all made him feel suffocated. Camping, on the other hand, was his escape. Alone in the wilderness, he felt free. So when he stumbled across a blog raving about a trail called Silver Ridge, he knew he had to go. The trail was tucked deep in the mountains, with breathtaking views of jagged peaks and lush valleys. It wasn't popular, the Post warned, because it was unforgiving. Steep cliffs, unpredictable weather, and rumors of disappearances kept most hikers away. But that didn't deter Ethan. He lived for solitude and a challenge. The ascent. Ethan arrived at the trailhead just after dawn, his gear packed tightly in his hiking backpack. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. A faded wooden sign greeted him. Silver Ridge Trail. Proceed with caution. Hike at your own risk. He smirked. Sounds like my kind of place. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, where sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals darting through the underbrush. Ethan felt alive, but as the day wore on, the trail grew steeper and narrower. The forest thinned, giving way to rocky cliffs and sheer drops. Dark clouds gathered overhead, blotting out the sun. It was then that Ethan saw him. A man stood on the trail ahead, leaning on a hiking staff. He wore a weathered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Ethan's first thought was relief. He hadn't expected to see anyone else out here. "Hey there," Ethan called, raising a hand. The man turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face etched with deep lines. His eyes were dark and piercing, and his expression was unreadable. "Not many people come up this way," the man said, his voice gravelly. Ethan shrugged. "I like the quiet." The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "Be careful on this trail. It has a way of testing people." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, frowning. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the ridge ahead. "There's a storm coming. You'll want to find shelter before nightfall." Ethan glanced at the sky. The clouds were darker now, swirling ominously. He turned back to the man to ask if there was a campsite nearby, but the trail was empty. The man was gone. The storm. Ethan's unease grew as he continued up the trail. He told himself the man must have taken a side path or moved faster than expected. But deep down, he felt something wasn't right. By late afternoon, the storm hit. Rain lashed against him, and the wind howled, threatening to throw him off balance. The trail became slick with mud, and visibility dropped to near zero. He cursed himself for ignoring the man's warning. He should have turned back when he had the chance. Desperate for shelter, Ethan scanned the landscape. That's when he spotted it, a narrow cave tucked into the side of the ridge. He scrambled toward it, slipping and sliding on the wet rocks. Inside, the cave was cold and damp, but it offered protection from the storm. Ethan set up his small portable stove and made a quick meal. As the wind howled outside, he couldn't shake the memory of the man's cryptic words. It has a way of testing people. The whispering wind. That night, Ethan awoke to a strange sound. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling through the cave entrance. But as he listened closer, he realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice. Ethan, his blood ran cold. He sat up, his flashlight sweeping the cave. It was empty. Ethan. The voice was louder now, and it came from outside. Gripping his flashlight, he crawled to the cave entrance and peered into the storm. There, on the trail below, was the man. He stood motionless, his wide-brimmed hat shielding his face from the rain. But something was different. His figure seemed faint, almost translucent, and the rain didn't touch him. "Who are you?" Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. The man raised his hiking staff and pointed to the ridge. "The storm will pass. Keep moving." Before Ethan could respond, the man vanished into thin air. The ridge. By morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the forest eerily silent. Ethan debated turning back, but curiosity and pride pushed him onward. He had to know who the man was and why he had appeared. The trail grew steeper, winding along the edge of a cliff. The drop was dizzying, and Ethan's heart raced as he navigated the narrow path. Then he saw it, a small, weathered plaque embedded in the rock. In memory of Daniel Reeves. Lost to the Ridge, 1983. Ethan stared at the name, his mind racing. Could this be the man he had seen? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. The man's gaunt face, his weathered jacket, it all fit. But how could that be possible? The descent. Shaken, Ethan decided to cut his trip short. The trail felt different now, heavy with an unexplainable weight. He couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the man to appear again. By the time he reached the trailhead, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. A park ranger was locking up a small information kiosk nearby. Ethan approached him, hoping for answers. "Excuse me," he said. "Can I ask you about Daniel Reeves?" The ranger frowned. "Daniel Reeves? That's an old story. He was a hiker who went missing on Silver Ridge years ago. Some say he fell during a storm. Others think he got lost. We never found his body. Ethan's stomach churned. Has anyone seen him since? The ranger hesitated, his expression unreadable. There have been stories. People claim to see a man matching his description. He warns them about the trail, about storms. But when they go looking for him, he's gone. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you think?" he asked. The ranger shrugged. "I think some places hold on to their stories, and some people never really leave." Epilogue: Ethan never returned to Silver Ridge, but on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through the trees, he sometimes hears a voice calling his name, faint and gravelly, and he wonders if Daniel Reeves is still out there, walking the ridge, warning those who dare to follow in his footsteps. Story 3. The Shadow by the Fire. The forest was alive with sounds. The chirping of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant hoot of an owl. A group of 6 friends had gathered around a roaring campfire, their faces lit with flickering orange light. It was the first night of their annual camping trip, a tradition that had started in college and persisted even as adulthood began pulling them in different directions. This year, Maya had chosen the location, Ravenwood Forest, a sprawling, ancient wilderness with towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark sky. "This place has some serious Blair Witch vibes," Derek joked as he poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling upward. "Perfect for ghost stories," Maya replied, her voice tinged with excitement. The others groaned. They knew Maya loved scaring people. She had a knack for weaving tales that felt too real. "Let's hear it then," Liam said, leaning back against a log. "You'll regret asking," Zara muttered, hugging her knees. But before Maya could begin, Rachel, the quietest of the group, interrupted. "Actually, I have a story." Everyone turned to her in surprise. Rachel rarely spoke during these trips, preferring to listen rather than join in. "It's about shadows," she said, her voice low and deliberate. Rachel's story. "There's an old legend about shadows in the forest," Rachel began. "They say that shadows are more than just tricks of light, that sometimes they have minds of their own. Long ago, a traveler got lost in these woods. He made a fire to keep warm, but as the flames danced, he noticed something strange. There were shadows cast by the fire, but one of them wasn't his. It moved when he didn't. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but the shadow grew bolder. It began to mimic his movements, like a cruel mockery. Then it started to move closer, closer to him, closer to the fire. The traveler tried to run, but the shadow followed. It didn't need light to exist. It clung to him, wrapping around him like a second skin. The next morning, all that was left was the man's fire, still burning, and a single shadow burned into the ground. Some say he's still out here, wandering, that if you're not careful, his shadow might mistake you for him. A heavy silence fell over the group. The fire crackled, but no one spoke. "Okay, that's creepy as hell," Derek finally said, trying to lighten the mood. Agreed, Liam added. Why do you know this stuff, Rachel? She shrugged, her lips curling into a faint smile. It's just a story. The first shadow. The group eventually moved on, laughing nervously and sharing less spooky tales. The tension seemed to dissipate as the fire grew smaller, its flames licking at the cooling air. But Zara noticed it first. Wait, she said, her voice sharp. What? Maya asked, looking up. Count the shadows. The group turned toward the ground, where their shadows stretched long and thin in the firelight. There should have been 6, one for each of them, but there were 7. At first, they thought it was a trick of the fire, the shifting flames creating an illusion. But as they moved, so did the shadows. Each shadow mirrored its owner, except for one. The 7th shadow stood still. The unease. That's not normal, Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. Derek grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing unusual. Who's playing a prank? He asked, though his voice lacked confidence. No one answered. The 7th shadow remained, standing still among the dancing forms. It was unnaturally dark, as though it absorbed the firelight instead of reflecting it. Maya stood and walked toward the fire, trying to see if she could figure out what was casting it. But as she moved closer, so did the shadow. It wasn't a mimic. It was an intruder. The 2nd shadow. Maybe we should go inside the tents, Zara suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Liam said firmly. If this is just some weird trick, we're not letting it scare us. We'll figure it out. But as he spoke, something changed. A 2nd shadow broke away from the first and began to move. Okay, that's enough, Derek said, his voice rising. Who's doing this? It's not us, Maya shouted, backing away. The 2nd shadow moved erratically, twitching and jerking as if it were learning how to move. It didn't follow the group anymore. Instead, it circled the fire, its form growing darker and more defined with each pass. Turn off the fire, Rachel said suddenly. What? Maya asked, her voice high-pitched. Put it out. If there's no fire, there's no light for shadows. Extinguishing the fire. Panicked, Derek grabbed the water jug and doused the flames. The fire hissed and sputtered, plunging the group into near total darkness. Only the faint light of a distant crescent moon illuminated the clearing. For a moment, everything was silent. See? Rachel whispered. It's gone. But then Zara screamed. The shadows weren't gone. They were darker than ever, moving freely now without the constraint of the firelight. The chaos. The shadows twisted and writhed, darting between the campers like smoke. One by one, the group scattered, running blindly into the forest. Ethan sprinted until his lungs burned, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the darkness. The shadows seemed to multiply, stretching impossibly long as they reached for him. the shadows embrace. Back at the campsite, Rachel remained frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the ground. The original shadow, the seventh one, was still there, but now it was hers. She watched in horror as it began to move independently, mimicking her every motion, but with a delay, as though mocking her hesitation. "Please," she whispered, "leave me alone." The shadow tilted its head, almost curiously, before lunging toward her. The aftermath. When morning came, park rangers found the campsite empty. The tents were intact, the fire pit cold, but there was no sign of the 6 campers, except for their shadows. Burned into the ground in perfect detail, 6 shadows encircled the fire pit, frozen in eternal terror. And in the center of the circle was a 7th shadow, watching, waiting for the next group to arrive. Story 4. Footsteps around the tent. Mark had always been a solo adventurer. The quiet serenity of the woods brought him a sense of peace he couldn't find anywhere else. He loved the feeling of disconnecting from the world, just him, his gear, and the wilderness. This time, he decided to camp at Hollow Creek, a remote and heavily wooded area known for its isolation. Locals had warned him about the place. There were stories, whispers of people who went into Hollow Creek and came out different or not at all. Mark dismissed the tales as folklore, the kind of spooky stories townsfolk told to keep outsiders away. It was his 3rd night in the woods when the silence around his campsite became oppressive. The perfect camp spot. Mark had set up his tent in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. A small brook trickled nearby, and the scent of moss and damp earth filled the air. He cooked his dinner over a small fire and leaned back in his camping chair, staring at the stars. The forest was unusually quiet that night. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted, just an eerie, unbroken silence. "Must be the remoteness," Mark muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. As the fire died down, he retreated into his tent, zipping it up tightly behind him. His flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the fabric walls as he settled into his sleeping bag. The first footsteps. Sometime in the middle of the night, Mark woke abruptly. At first, he wasn't sure what had roused him. The forest was still silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the woods were holding their breath. Then he heard it. Crunch. A single footstep, somewhere just outside his tent. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He held his breath, straining to hear. Crunch. Another step, closer this time. He reached for his flashlight and clicked it on, the beam illuminating the interior of his tent. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," Mark called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. No response. He listened for several minutes, but the only sound was his own ragged breathing. After convincing himself it was just an animal, he lay back down and eventually drifted off, circling the tent. The second time he woke, it was to a more distinct sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps were circling his tent, slow and deliberate. Mark sat upright, gripping his flashlight tightly. He unzipped the tent slightly and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast long shadows across the clearing, but there was no sign of anyone. The footsteps continued, always just beyond his line of sight. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent again. Then came a sound that made Mark's blood run cold. A low, guttural chuckle, distant yet impossibly close. Mark zipped the tent shut and backed away from the opening, his heart hammering. Hours of terror. The footsteps resumed, now faster, more erratic. They circled the tent over and over, occasionally stopping, only to start again. Mark sat in the center of his tent, clutching a hunting knife in one hand and his flashlight in the other. At one point, the footsteps approached the tent directly. Mark held his breath as a shadow passed over the fabric, lingering for a moment before retreating. He considered making a run for it, but dismissed the idea. Whatever was out there had him surrounded, and the forest was pitch black. He wouldn't make it far. The morning after, somehow, Mark must have fallen asleep, though he couldn't remember when. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, and the oppressive weight of the night began to lift. Cautiously, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The ground around his campsite was covered in footprints. Hundreds of them, bare and human-like, crisscrossed the clearing in chaotic patterns. Some were large, others small, as if made by people of all ages. Mark's stomach churned. He crouched to examine one of the prints. It was fresh, the edges of the impression still sharp in the damp earth. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of who or what had been there. But the forest was empty, as silent and still as ever. The brook. As he packed up his gear in a hurry, Mark noticed something odd near the brook. The footprints led to the water's edge, but didn't continue on the other side. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had been there had vanished in the thin air. Mark's mind raced as he replayed the events of the night. The circling footsteps, the shadow, the laughter. It all felt like a nightmare. But the prints were real, undeniable evidence of something unnatural. The drive home, Mark didn't waste any time leaving Hollow Creek. He hiked back to his car in record time, his eyes constantly scanning the trees for movement. Even as he drove away, the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. He glanced in his rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see a shadowy figure trailing him. The aftermath. Mark swore he would never camp alone again. For weeks, he couldn't sleep, haunted by the sound of footsteps in his dreams. One night, desperate for answers, he posted about his experience on a camping forum. The responses were mixed. Some dismissed it as a prank, while others shared eerily similar stories about Hollow Creek. One reply stood out: "You're lucky you left. Not everyone does." Mark stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He clicked on the user's profile, but it was blank. The message was gone. Epilogue. Months later, Mark returned to Hollow Creek, not out of curiosity, but necessity. A close friend had gone missing in the area, and a search party had been organized. As the group combed through the forest, Mark noticed something chilling near an abandoned campsite. Hundreds of barefoot prints circling an extinguished fire. And then he heard it. Crunch, crunch. Mark turned, but there was nothing there. The forest was silent once more. Story 5. The Screaming Gorge. The locals called it the Screaming Gorge, but Jenna, Chris, and their friends dismissed the warnings as small-town superstition. It was their annual camping trip, and the secluded gorge promised spectacular views and an escape from their daily grind. They weren't the kind to be spooked by ghost stories, even ones as chilling as the legend tied to this place. The story, as told by the gas station attendant when they stopped for directions, was straightforward enough. Decades ago, a miner named Tobias Hart had been searching for gold in the gorge when he slipped and fell into its depths. His screams echoed through the canyon for hours before silence finally claimed him. Now, it was said, the gorge still carried his screams, long, mournful wails that lured campers to the edge, compelling them to join Tobias in his eternal descent. Sounds like a tourist trap to me, Chris had said, laughing. But as the group reached the site and set up camp near the gorge, even Chris seemed uneasy. The first night, the campsite was perfect, perched just far enough from the edge of the gorge to feel safe, yet close enough to enjoy the view. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold, its light reflecting off the jagged rocks below. "This place is amazing," Jenna said, snapping a photo of the scenery. "It'll look even better in the morning," Chris replied. The group spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The air grew colder as the night deepened, and a fog began to roll in, creeping toward them like a living thing. "I don't like this," Mia said, pulling her jacket tighter. "It feels wrong." "Oh, come on," Chris scoffed. "You're not seriously buying into that minor ghost story, are you?" But as the firelight flickered and the wind carried strange, distant sounds, no one laughed. The first screams, it started just after midnight. Jenna was the first to hear it. A faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" she asked, sitting bolt upright in her sleeping bag. "Hear what?" Chris replied groggily. "Chill," Jenna hissed. The camp fell silent, everyone straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves and the crackle of the dying fire. Then it came again, a long, blood-curdling scream echoing from the depths of the gorge. "What the hell was that?" Mia whispered, her face pale. "It's just the wind," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the scream came again, louder this time, a sound so full of agony it seemed to seep into their bones. "That's not the wind," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "A haunting call." The screams grew more frequent as the night wore on, sometimes distant, sometimes so close they seemed to come from just beyond the trees. Each one was filled with raw pain, as though whoever, or whatever, was screaming had been suffering for decades. "I'm not staying here," Mia said, her voice rising in panic. "We need to leave. Now. It's the middle of the night," Chris argued. "You want to stumble around in the dark and risk falling into the gorge?" Mia glared at him, but didn't reply. "Let's just stay in the tents," Jenna suggested. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." Reluctantly, the group agreed, retreating to their tents. But sleep didn't come easily. The screams continued, punctuated by strange rustling sounds and whispers that seemed to come from all around. Drawn to the edge, sometime before dawn, Jenna woke to a strange sensation. It was as though someone or something was calling to her, pulling her toward the gorge. She unzipped her tent and stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The fire had long since died, and the fog was thicker than ever, swirling in ghostly patterns around the camp. The screams were louder now, echoing endlessly through the gorge. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices. "Help me," one cried. "Don't leave me," whispered another. Jenna's feet moved on their own, carrying her toward the edge of the gorge. The lure of the gorge. "Jenna!" Chris's voice cut through the fog, breaking whatever trance she'd been under. She stopped, her toes just inches from the crumbling edge. "What are you doing?" Chris demanded, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. I don't know," Jenna stammered. I heard them. They need help. There's no one there." Chris snapped, shaking her slightly. But as he spoke, the screams rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out his voice. The ground beneath them trembled, sending loose rocks tumbling into the abyss. The morning revelation. Somehow, they made it through the night. The screams faded with the first light of dawn, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. The group packed up their gear in silence, their faces pale and drawn. As they prepared to leave, Jenna noticed something near the edge of the gorge. Footprints, hundreds of them, worn into the rocky soil, all leading toward the edge. "They're not ours," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. The group stared at the prints, their shapes human but somehow wrong. Too long, too narrow, and spaced as though the owners had been dragging their feet. "Let's go," Chris said, his voice shaking. A final warning. As they hiked back to their car, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. Not a single bird chirped, and the wind carried an unnatural chill. At the trailhead, they passed a sign they hadn't noticed on their way in. The wood was weathered and cracked, the letters barely legible. Warning: do not camp near the gorge. Someone had scratched a message beneath it. He screams because he's not alone anymore. Jenna stared at the sign, her heart pounding. She turned to the others, but before she could speak, the wind carried a faint, distant scream. And this time, it sounded like her own voice. Story 6. The empty campsite. It was supposed to be a simple weekend hike. Ben, Lisa, and their college friends, Alex and Rachel, had planned the trip to Redwood Valley for months. The trail was known for its untouched beauty, secluded pathways, and breathtaking views. But amidst all its charm, it also had a darker reputation. Stories of people who entered the valley and never came back. Ben laughed off the warnings. Urban legends, he said, waving away their concerns. Lisa, who was always the cautious one, didn't seem so sure. But the group decided to go anyway. The promise of an adventure outweighed their unease. Discovery in the woods. The first day was uneventful. The group hiked along the winding trail, surrounded by towering redwoods and the chirping of unseen birds. They set up camp near a creek, roasted marshmallows, and told silly stories around the fire. By the second day, their spirits were high, and they decided to explore deeper into the valley. The trail became rougher, the trees denser. The air carried a strange stillness, as though the forest were watching them. It was mid-afternoon when Alex spotted it, an old campsite tucked between the trees, just off the trail. "Hey, check this out," he called, waving them over. A fire still burning. The scene was bizarre. A tent, faded and weathered, stood crookedly in the clearing. A campfire in the center burned steadily, its flames licking the air. A pan of half-eaten stew rested on a makeshift grill, and a mug of coffee sat beside it, steam still rising into the cool air. "Did someone just leave this here?" Lisa asked, frowning. "No way," Ben said, shaking his head. "Look at that tent. It's falling apart. This stuff has been here for years." "But the fire," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "It's fresh. And that coffee, it's hot." No one had an explanation. The campsite looked abandoned, yet everything suggested the opposite. Searching for signs, they searched the area, calling out to see if anyone was nearby. "Hello," Ben yelled. "Anyone here?" The forest answered only with silence. Lisa crouched near the fire, examining the stew. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered. "Food this old should be spoiled, but it smells fresh." Ben picked up a rusted camping knife lying nearby. "This thing looks ancient," he said, running his fingers over its corroded surface. "Like it's been out here for decades." "Guys," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Look at this." She held up a notebook she'd found inside the tent. The cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were legible. The last entry sent a chill through them all. August 15th, 1979. "The noises are back tonight. They're closer. I can feel them watching me. If anyone finds this, please don't stay here. Leave while you can." The first night, despite the eerie discovery, they decided to set up camp a short distance from the abandoned site. It was getting late, and hiking back in the dark seemed more dangerous than staying. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their ears. Ben tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and telling stories, but even he couldn't shake the unease. Around midnight, Lisa woke to a strange sound. Crunch, It was faint at first, like someone stepping on dried leaves. Then it grew louder, circling their campsite. "Ben," Lisa whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, sitting up. "Listen." The crunching stopped. "Probably just an animal," Ben said, though he didn't sound convinced. But as they lay back down, the sound returned, louder and closer. The missing mug. Morning brought little relief. The forest seemed heavier, the sunlight dimmed by a thick canopy of trees. As they packed up to leave, Rachel noticed something odd. "Where's my mug?" she asked, looking around. "What mug?" Alex asked. "The one I left by the fire last night," Rachel said. "It's gone." They searched the area, but found nothing. The mug had disappeared without a trace. "Maybe you packed it by mistake," Ben said. Rachel shook her head. "I didn't. I know where I left it. A trail of footprints." They decided to head back to the main trail, but as they started walking, Lisa noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. A trail of footprints leading away from the abandoned campsite. The prints were strange, barefoot and impossibly large, with toes that seemed to claw into the earth. "They weren't here yesterday," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Let's just keep moving," Ben said, urging them forward. But the footprints seemed to follow them, appearing sporadically along the trail, as though something was shadowing their every move. The forest turns. By late afternoon, the group realized they were lost. The trail they'd been following had vanished, replaced by dense trees and overgrown brush. "We're going in circles," Lisa said, panic rising in her voice. "I recognize that tree. We've passed it before." "Calm down," Ben said, though he didn't sound calm himself. "We'll figure it out." As the sun dipped lower, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the oppressive silence returned. Then they heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered. "Probably just the wind," Alex said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the sound. Back to the campsite. As night fell, they stumbled back into the abandoned campsite. The tent, the fire, the half-eaten food, it was all still there, exactly as they'd left it. "No," Lisa said, shaking her head. "This isn't possible. We left this place hours ago." The fire, impossibly, was still burning. The stew still steamed, and the coffee, untouched, looked as fresh as it had the day before. "We have to leave," Rachel said, her voice breaking. But the forest had other plans. The screams. As they tried to retrace their steps, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It wasn't human. It was something guttural, primal, and filled with rage. The group froze, their hearts pounding. "What was that?" Alex whispered. Before anyone could answer, the scream came again, closer this time. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew thick with a metallic scent. "Run!" Ben shouted, and they took off, crashing through the underbrush. The final revelation. When they finally emerged from the forest, exhausted and terrified, they found themselves not on the trail, but at the edge of the gorge. And there, waiting for them, was the abandoned campsite. The fire still burned, the stew still steamed, and the tent stood crookedly, as though mocking their escape. It was then they realized they had never left. Epilogue. Weeks later, a park ranger found their abandoned gear near the gorge. The fire was out, the food untouched, and the tent covered in moss, as though it had been there for decades. There was no sign of the hikers, but every now and then, campers report seeing a flickering fire in the distance and hearing faint voices calling for help. And when they approach, they find nothing but an empty campsite. Story 7. The Silent Visitor. The rugged hills of Black Hollow Forest stretch for miles, a popular destination for campers looking to escape the humdrum of daily life. But beneath its serene canopy, Black Hollow carried whispers of the inexplicable. Tales of eerie encounters were traded among locals like ghost stories meant to scare city folk. Chris, Emily, Jake, and Mia weren't fazed by the rumors. To them, it was just another adventure. Armed with camping gear, flashlights, and enough snacks to last days, they pitched their tents deep in the forest, far from the nearest trailhead. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, a symphony of nature. They didn't know the silence that would follow, the uneasy night. It was their first evening in the woods. After a long day of hiking, they gathered around the campfire, laughing and recounting old stories. The flames crackled, casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. Mia had just finished a ghost story about a spirit that haunted campers who left food out overnight when Jake interrupted with a loud laugh. "If there's any ghost here, it better bring me coffee," he joked, tossing a twig into the fire. Emily rolled her eyes. "You'll regret saying that if something shows up." It wasn't long before the cold night air drove them into their tents. Sleep came easily, but the peace wouldn't last. The first sign, Chris woke up just after midnight. Something had stirred him. A noise perhaps, though he couldn't place it. He unzipped his tent slightly and peered out into the darkness. The campfire embers still glowed faintly, their orange light casting eerie shapes onto the trees. That's when he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the campsite, motionless. Chris squinted, trying to make sense of it. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, and entirely featureless in the dim light. His first thought was that it was Jake playing a prank. "Jake?" Chris called softly. The figure didn't move. "Jake, I see you." Chris tried again, louder this time. No response. Chris grabbed his flashlight, his fingers trembling slightly, and pointed it toward the figure. But when the beam cut through the darkness, the figure was gone. Footprints in the dirt. The next morning, Chris told the group what he'd seen. "Probably a shadow," Jake said dismissively. "Or you were dreaming." Emily frowned. "I don't know. What if someone's out here?" Jake waved her off, but Mia's expression mirrored Emily's concern. "Maybe we should check around," she suggested. The group searched the area. The dirt around their campsite showed no signs of recent disturbance, at least at first glance. Then Emily froze. "Look at this," she said, pointing near Chris's tent. There, in the soft earth, was a single footprint, barefoot. Its outline was impossibly large, with deep grooves where the toes should have been. It was pointed toward Chris's tent. Growing tensions. That night, the group was on edge. They gathered close to the fire, their conversation subdued. Even Jake seemed quieter than usual, his confident bravado dimmed by the footprint they couldn't explain. "Maybe it was an animal," Jake offered half-heartedly. "What kind of animal has feet like that?" Mia shot back. Silence fell over them. The fire's light danced in their uneasy faces, and the forest around them seemed darker. The usual nighttime sounds eerily absent. When they retreated to their tents, no one slept easily. The visitor returns. It was past midnight when it happened again. This time, it was Emily who woke first. She had the strangest feeling, as though someone were watching her. She opened her eyes and turned her head toward the small window of her tent. A dark shape stood just beyond the glow of the dying campfire. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same figure Chris had described, tall, unmoving, and faceless in the shadows. "Jake?" she whispered, though she knew it wasn't him. She reached for her flashlight, her fingers trembling. When she shone it toward the figure, it vanished, leaving only the darkness. But now, Emily noticed something else. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, they circled the campsite. "Wake up!" Emily yelled, unzipping her tent. The others scrambled out of their tents, flashlights and phones in hand. "What is it?" Mia asked, her voice quivering. Emily pointed toward the trees. "There was someone there. I saw them." Chris scanned the area with his flashlight, but saw nothing. The forest was still, as though holding its breath. Then Mia screamed. She pointed at the ground. Dozens of barefoot prints surrounded their tents, overlapping and crisscrossing chaotically. "Those weren't there earlier," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. A night of terror. The group decided to stay awake, huddled around the campfire. They whispered theories, an animal, a prank, maybe even a hallucination, but none of them felt convincing. The footsteps returned just before dawn. This time, they were louder, heavier. They didn't circle the campsite. They stopped just short of their tents. "Do you see anything?" Chris whispered. His flashlight pointed toward the darkness. Jake shook his head, his bravado completely gone. Nothing, but they could all feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The escape. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they wasted no time packing up. The forest seemed lighter, less oppressive in the daylight, but the footprints were still there, a haunting reminder of the night. As they hurried down the trail, Mia glanced back and gasped. "What?" Jake asked, turning. "Nothing," Mia said quickly, shaking her head. But she'd seen it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them leave. The final footprints. They made it back to their car and drove away in silence, the events of the past 2 nights weighing heavily on them. It wasn't until they stopped at a gas station miles from the forest that Jake noticed something. On the dusty rear windshield of the car was a single handprint, but it wasn't human. Epilogue: the group vowed never to return to Black Hollow Forest. Over time, they drifted apart, but the memories of that night stayed with them. Occasionally, Chris would wake in the middle of the night, convinced he'd heard footsteps outside his window. And every now and then, Mia swore she saw a shadow standing just beyond the reach of her porch light. But when she turned on the light, it was always gone. Always. Story 8. The Missing Time. The Mariner Pines Forest was known for its vast, open sky, a haven for stargazers and astronomers alike. Tucked away from city lights, its remote campgrounds offered an unspoiled view of the cosmos. It was the perfect spot for Taylor, Jenna, Marcus, and Brianna to spend a weekend reconnecting with nature. The group arrived just before dusk, their car loaded with tents, coolers, and a telescope. Taylor, an amateur astronomer, was most excited about the trip. He'd read about a rare meteor shower expected that night and couldn't wait to see it. None of them knew they'd see something much stranger than falling stars. A sky full of wonders. The campsite was picturesque. A small clearing surrounded by tall, whispering pines. The group set up their tents, built a fire, and ate dinner as the last streaks of sunlight faded. Soon, the sky was a vast expanse of black velvet dotted with countless stars. Taylor set up his telescope, adjusting it with practiced precision. "This is going to be amazing," he said, motioning for the others to join him. As the hours passed, they spotted meteors streaking across the sky. Their excitement grew with each burst of light. Then came the first anomaly. "Did you see that?" Jenna asked, pointing to a bright, pulsating light moving unnaturally across the horizon. "Satellite," Marcus said dismissively, but even he sounded unsure. Taylor frowned. "No way. Satellites move in steady orbits. That thing just zigzagged." The light hovered for a moment before vanishing completely. "Okay, that was weird," Brianna admitted. Taylor grinned nervously. "Let's just keep watching. Probably nothing." But deep down, they all felt a growing unease. The lights returned. Around midnight, the strange light reappeared, this time directly above them. It wasn't alone. Smaller lights, glowing white and blue, orbited the larger one, moving in perfect synchronization. "Taylor, what the hell is that?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. "I don't know," Taylor admitted, his eyes glued to the sky. "It's too bright for a drone and too quiet for a plane." The lights suddenly began to descend. The group instinctively backed toward the fire, their breaths quickening. The clearing was bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow, and a low hum vibrated through the air. Then, everything went black. The missing hours. When Taylor opened his eyes, the fire was out. The night was silent, save for the rustling of the trees. He sat up, his head pounding. The sky above was still, the stars in their usual places. "What happened?" he muttered. The others were stirring as well. Jenna was the first to speak. "What time is it?" she asked groggily. Taylor checked his watch and froze. 3:47 a.m. That can't be right. It was just midnight. Marcus groaned. "No way. That's 3 hours gone." Brianna stood, wobbling slightly. "Do you guys remember anything? The lights? That sound?" They all shook their heads. Their last memory was the lights descending, then nothing. "Taylor," Jenna said suddenly, her voice shaking. "Your arm." He looked down and saw 3 parallel marks running along his forearm. The skin was red and raw, as if he'd been restrained. A clue in the dirt. Panic set in as they searched their surroundings for answers. Jenna noticed something first, a series of imprints in the dirt at the edge of the campsite. "They're not human footprints," she whispered. The impressions were oval-shaped, with strange ridges running through them. They were too large and too symmetrical to belong to any known animal. Taylor examined them closely, his mind racing. They lead toward the woods. Are you seriously suggesting we follow them?" Marcus asked, incredulous. "Do you have a better idea?" Taylor shot back. Reluctantly, they grabbed their flashlights and followed the trail. The clearing. The footprints led them to another clearing, smaller and more secluded than their campsite. At its center was a circular patch of grass, flattened and scorched. "What the hell is this?" Brianna whispered, stepping closer. Taylor knelt and touched the blackened ground. It was warm. "Guys," Jenna called, pointing to a nearby tree. Scratched into its bark was a series of strange symbols, zigzags, circles, and lines that seemed almost mathematical. "This isn't natural," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." The others agreed. They hurried back to their campsite, the oppressive silence of the forest weighing heavily on them. The return of the lights. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, too afraid to sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they packed up and left in record time. As they drove away, Taylor glanced out the window and froze. The same lights from the night before hovered in the distance, watching them. "Do you see that?" he asked. No one answered. They didn't want to look. Unanswered questions. Back in town, they decided to visit the local ranger station to report what they'd seen. The ranger, a grizzled man in his 50s, listened intently but said little. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first to come in with a story like this," he admitted. "What do you mean?" Taylor asked. "People have been seeing those lights for decades," the ranger said. "Always around Mariner Pines. Always the same thing. Missing time, strange marks, weird symbols. Do you know what it is?" Jenna asked. The ranger shook his head. "No one does. But if I were you, I'd stay far away from that forest." Lingering effects. Over the following weeks, the group tried to move on, but the experience haunted them. Taylor became obsessed with the marks on his arm. They hadn't faded. If anything, they seemed to glow faintly under certain lights. Jenna started waking up in the middle of the night, convinced she could hear the hum they'd heard in the forest. Brianna developed an irrational fear of the dark, always leaving a light on when she slept. And Marcus? He stopped answering their calls. When they went to his apartment, they found it empty, his belongings untouched. The final encounter. Months later, Taylor received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the clearing where they'd found the scorched grass, but this time there was something standing in the center. A tall, thin figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Written on the back of the photo were 3 words. They remember you. Story 9. The Lake's Curse. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of the Sable Ridge, casting a fiery glow over the remote wilderness. Jack, Clara, Mason, and Olivia had set up camp by Hollow Lake, a body of water so isolated that it didn't appear on most maps. It was a place Mason had discovered during a solo hike months ago, and he had insisted they visit it for a weekend of fishing and relaxation. The lake was breathtakingly beautiful, its surface so still and clear it reflected the sky like a mirror. But something about its tranquility felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on them. The first splash. Jack cast his line into the water, watching the ripples expand outward. "This place is perfect," he said, leaning back on his makeshift stool. "No cell service, no noise, just us and nature." Olivia smiled, brushing her auburn hair back. "And no fish, apparently," she teased, gesturing to the empty bucket by their feet. Mason frowned. "There are fish. I've seen them before. Just give it time." The 4 of them settled into an easy rhythm, talking and joking as the sun dipped lower. But as the shadows grew longer, an eerie sound interrupted their laughter. A loud splash, too close to be a fish jumping, but too sudden to be anything else. Clara glanced at the water. "What was that?" Jack shrugged. "Probably a big fish." "Then why didn't it take the bait?" Olivia asked, her voice tinged with unease. Mason stood, scanning the lake. "It's nothing. Let's keep fishing." But the splash came again, louder this time, as if something large had broken the surface and sunk back down. The water rippled violently, yet the lake's surface returned to stillness in seconds. "I don't like this," Clara muttered, gripping her fishing rod tightly. A warning on the wind. As night fell, the group abandoned their fishing efforts and returned to their campfire. The crackling flames offered some comfort, but an odd chill hung in the air, despite the summer heat. "Maybe the fish are just shy," Jack joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Or maybe there's something wrong with this lake," Clara replied, staring into the fire. "It feels off." Mason rolled his eyes. "Come on, Clara. It's just a lake. You're letting your imagination run wild." But Olivia was quiet, her gaze fixed on the water. "Did anyone notice how clear it is? Like, unnaturally clear. You can see straight to the bottom, even at night." Jack chuckled nervously. "That's a good thing, right? No murky water, no surprises." Clara shook her head. It's too perfect, too still, like it's waiting for something. A sudden gust of wind blew through the campsite, extinguishing the fire. The group scrambled to relight it, but the chill that followed the wind lingered, sending shivers down their spines. The dripping figure. The group retreated to their tents after dinner, uneasy but too tired to argue. Sleep came fitfully, with each of them waking periodically to the faint sound of splashing outside. At some point in the night, Clara sat up in her tent, her heart racing. She'd heard something, a soft, rhythmic sound like dripping water. She unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside. Standing at the edge of the campsite was a figure, hunched and shrouded in shadows. Its form glistened in the moonlight, water pooling at its feet. "Who's there?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The figure straightened, turning its head toward her. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes sunken yet glowing faintly. Water dripped from its hair, its tattered clothes clinging to its skeletal frame. "Leave," it croaked, its voice gurgling like it was speaking through water. "The lake is cursed. Leave before it claims you." Clara stumbled backward, her scream waking the others. Mason burst out of his tent with a flashlight, but the figure was gone, leaving only wet footprints leading back to the lake. The legend of Hollow Lake. The group huddled around the fire, their fear palpable. Clara recounted what she'd seen, her voice shaking. "It said the lake is cursed. What does that even mean?" Mason frowned, his flashlight scanning the tree line. "It's probably some prank, a local trying to scare us off." "But why?" Olivia asked. "We're not bothering anyone." Jack, visibly shaken, spoke up. "I've heard stories about places like this, supposedly haunted lakes where people drown mysteriously or vanish without a trace." "Great," Clara snapped. "And you didn't think to share that before we came here?" Mason sighed. "It's just an old wives' tale. There's no such thing as a cursed lake." But as the night wore on, their nerves were stretched thin. The splashing sounds continued, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from the water itself. A dreadful discovery. At dawn, they decided to explore the shoreline, hoping to find some rational explanation. What they found instead chilled them to the core. Near a cluster of rocks, they discovered an old, rusted fishing boat, half sunken in the shallows. Inside were remnants of fishing gear, a moldy tackle box, and a waterlogged journal. Jack opened the journal carefully, its pages brittle and damp. The entries were sparse but haunting. May 12th. The lake is too quiet. No fish biting. Strange sounds at night. May 14th. Saw a figure on the shore. Thought it was another camper, but it vanished. May 16th. I feel like I'm being watched. The splashing won't stop. The last entry sent a shiver down their spines. May 18th. If anyone finds this, leave the lake. It won't let you go. The final night. Despite their growing fear, Mason insisted they stay one more night. "We're overreacting," he argued. "Let's just sleep and head out tomorrow." But as darkness fell, the lake grew restless. The splashing became louder, more erratic. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping into an unintelligible chorus. And then the figure appeared again. It stood at the water's edge, its eyes glowing brighter than before. "You were warned," it rasped. "The lake wants you." Suddenly, the whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices pleading, screaming, and crying. The water churned violently, waves lapping at the shore despite the still air. The group scrambled to pack their belongings, abandoning the campfire as they raced toward their car. The figure watched them, unmoving, as they sped away. The lakes told. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away. No one spoke, their minds racing with fear and unanswered questions. Weeks later, Clara searched for information about Hollow Lake, but found nothing. No records, no maps, not even rumors. It was as if the place didn't exist. But they all remembered the dripping figure, the whispers, and the sense of being watched. They never returned to Sable Ridge, nor did they speak of the lake again. Some nights, though, Clara swore she could hear faint splashing outside her window, as if the lake wasn't quite done with her. Story 10. The Laughter in the Woods. The forest surrounding Maple Hollow was dense, its trees towering and gnarled, their branches weaving a canopy that blotted out the stars. When Kevin suggested a weekend camping trip to the area, his friends, Maya, Drew, and Erica, were excited. The promise of isolation, fresh air, and stories around the campfire seemed like the perfect getaway. By the time they pitched their tents in a small clearing near the heart of the forest, dusk was settling in. The air carried a hint of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and distant chirping of crickets. "This spot is perfect," Kevin declared, tossing down his backpack. "No noise, no distractions, just us and nature." "I don't know," Erica murmured, glancing at the encroaching trees. "Something about this place feels heavy." Drew laughed. "Heavy? It's just a bunch of trees, Erica. Don't tell me you're scared already." Erica rolled her eyes but didn't respond. Instead, she busied herself arranging the sleeping bags in the tent. The first laugh. The group spent the evening around a roaring fire, toasting marshmallows and swapping ghost stories. The moon climbed high, its silvery light filtering through the treetops. It was just past midnight when they first heard it, soft, lilting laughter echoing through the forest. Maya froze, her marshmallow halfway to her mouth. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Drew asked, glancing around. "That laughter," Maya said, her voice low. Like children, the group fell silent, straining their ears. The laughter came again, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees like a breeze. Kevin frowned. There shouldn't be anyone out here, let alone kids. The nearest town is miles away. Maybe it's another group camping nearby, Drew suggested. Erica shook her head. "We didn't see any cars or campsites on the way in. And why would kids be out here at this hour?" The laughter grew louder, seeming to circle the clearing. It wasn't cheerful or playful. There was something unnerving about it, as if it were mocking them. The playground. Unable to shake their curiosity, the group decided to investigate. Flashlights in hand, they followed the sound, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. After several minutes of walking, they stumbled upon something that made them stop in their tracks. An old, overgrown playground. The swings creaked as they swayed in the breeze. Their chains rusted and twisted. A seesaw sat lopsided, one end buried in the earth. A merry-go-round, covered in moss, was tilted at an odd angle. "What the hell?" Maya whispered, shining her flashlight around. "It's like something out of a horror movie," Erica said, stepping closer to the swings. Kevin ran his hand along a rusted slide, its surface pitted and jagged. "This must have been part of an old park or something. But why is it in the middle of the forest?" Before anyone could answer, the laughter returned, louder now, coming from every direction. The swings moved faster, their chains clinking violently. The merry-go-round spun slowly, though no one had touched it. "I don't like this," Erica said, backing away. "We should leave." The markings. As they turned to go, Drew's flashlight caught something carved into the bark of a nearby tree. He stepped closer, brushing away the moss. "What is it?" Maya asked, joining him. Drew's voice was grim. "Names and dates." The tree was covered in dozens of names, etched deep into the wood, each followed by a date. The dates spanned decades, the earliest from the 1940s, and the most recent only 2 years ago. "Maybe it's a memorial," Kevin suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "A memorial for what?" Erica asked, her voice trembling. Before Kevin could answer, the laughter erupted again, this time louder and more distorted. It sounded closer, almost as if the children were standing among them. The group huddled together, their flashlights darting through the trees. The shadows seemed to move, shifting unnaturally, as if alive. The missing children. Panicked, they ran back toward their campsite, stumbling through the underbrush. But when they reached the clearing, their tents were gone. "What the hell?" Drew yelled, spinning in circles. "This is where we set up, right? This has to be it." "It's gone," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Everything's gone." Erica sank to her knees, clutching her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Kevin knelt beside her, trying to calm her down, but his own hands were shaking. "We'll figure this out. We just need to stay together." As they tried to regroup, Maya noticed something sticking out of the ground near where the fire had been. She dug it out, her hands trembling. It was a child's shoe, old and caked with dirt. Her scream pierced the night, and the laughter returned, deafening now. The true horror. Desperate for answers, the group ran back to the playground. This time, they noticed something they had missed before, a plaque, half buried in the dirt near the merry-go-round. Maya wiped away the grime, revealing the inscription. "In memory of the children of Maple Hollow, who vanished without a trace." May their laughter echo forever. Vanished? Erica breathed, her face pale. What does that mean? Kevin turned to her, his face grim. It means this isn't just an old playground. It's a graveyard. Before they could react, the swings began moving violently, the merry-go-round spinning so fast it became a blur. The laughter grew to a crescendo, mingled with faint cries for help. And then they saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, small and translucent, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They looked like children, but their movements were jerky and unnatural. "Play with us," one of them whispered, its voice echoing like a broken record. "Escape?" The group bolted, sprinting blindly through the forest. The laughter followed them, growing fainter as they ran, but never truly fading. By the time they reached the road where they'd parked their car, the sun was beginning to rise. They piled in, slamming the doors and peeling out, leaving Maple Hollow behind. The aftermath. Back in town, they reported what had happened to the local authorities. The officer on duty gave them a strange look. "You camped in Maple Hollow?" he asked, shaking his head. "You're lucky you made it out." "Why?" Maya demanded. The officer leaned back in his chair. "Years ago, a group of children went missing in that forest. They were last seen playing in an old park. People say their spirits still haunt the place, looking for playmates." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the officer's words confirming their worst fears. To this day, they don't talk about what happened in the woods, but sometimes, late at night, they can still hear faint laughter echoing in their dreams.